More important, and especially to horror, is the antagonist, the villain or evil force that terrorizes the screen and assumes a starring role in our nightmares. It is arguable that horror villains are the real protagonists of the genre, if only insofar as they are much more memorable, expertly advertised, and well-known. But who or what exactly are they? The baddies of horror films range from zombies and humanoids to phantasms and serial killers, from demons and aliens to playthings and leprechauns, from vampires, werewolves, mummies, and goblins to clowns, witches, predators, and arachnids. Indeed, the horror movieverse is infested with hundreds of derivations of folklore monsters, religious spirits, and mythical creatures. The landscape is littered with thousands of ungodly servants, mutated beasts, and reanimated corpses. In short, horror villains take the form of our fears. They are the visual manifestations of what scares us. There are a couple of points to be made of horror antagonists that will serve to deepen our appreciation and understanding of the horror genre in its entirety. First off, many horror antagonists represent the opposite of what we expect from those we either depend on for help or love and live for. They are inverted archetypes, characters who appear familiar and innocent and loving, but who turn out to have creepier backgrounds or more nefarious motives. They are the hell-bent mothers of Carrie and Black Swan, the enfant terrible of The Omen and Ringu, and the unhinged doctors of Hostel and the Human Centipede. These are dark, sinister characters who reshape the way we think about those closest to us or those charged with bracing our health and well-being. Inverted archetypes frighten us because of the doubt and insecurity they instill. We learn there is a fine line between good and evil, and that people are not always who they appear to be. They take us off guard, turning what we believe we know inside out, and compelling us to think the unthinkable. That the people we love or trust are not only different from what we may have naively thought, but are in fact trying to harm or manipulate us. The second point is that horror antagonists often kill without any apparent logic or definable reason. Killing in other genres is typically inspired by recognizable motives, whether it's revenge, national calls to action, or even self-defense. But the baddies of horror rarely need an excuse to inflict the ultimate punishment on their victims. The evil they cause often appears totally random, cruelly unjust, and woefully capricious. Many of the great slasher villains, like Michael Myers in Halloween and Billy in Black Christmas, have no explanation for their murders. They kill almost instinctively, without cause and without remorse. Many of the great demonic forces in the horror canon, like Pazuzu in The Exorcist and Bathsheba in The Conjuring, do not cause pain and suffering on behalf of survival or vengeance, but seemingly for its own sake. Motives provide a form of closure. They allow the characters and, incidentally, the audience to grasp the rationale of the antagonist, impose some form of order, and gain some level of control. But antagonists with no motive do not afford us such comfort and know-how. We cannot adequately protect ourselves from a threat we don't understand, and we are most vulnerable when we don't expect anything or anybody to harm us. We learn that in horror films, like in life, there is often no cause or reason for the terror and the suffering. Victims, more often than not, are dealt cards they don't deserve, and sometimes there is nothing that can be done to prevent outcomes of a horrific nature. The last point is that horror antagonists, on the whole, are notoriously difficult to categorize. There is no taxonomy that neatly puts each and every villain into a cookie-cutter mold. There are two interesting reasons for this phenomenon that may serve to deepen our appreciation of horror. The first is that horror villains continue to evolve and reinvent themselves in terms of their appearance, behavior, predictability, and origin. Sometimes, once a trope or archetype has reached a certain pinnacle, it begins to fall into parody, and either the character slowly dissipates from the horror genre, or twists and variations breathe new life into the archetype. Whether one is a fan of zombies or witches or vampires or all of the above, it's easy to marvel at how these and other horror antagonists have undergone a significant metamorphosis throughout the decades. The second reason is that, every so often, a totally fresh and distinct villain will emerge from a writer's imagination that sets the genre on a new and exciting course. Some of the greatest horror films in history have introduced the audience to something utterly original and profoundly scary. There's the Gill Man from The Creature from the Black Lagoon, Pinhead from Hellraiser, Pennywise from It, and the Entity from It Follows, to name just a few. Overall, the horror genre stands out amongst its peers not only in its ability to both imaginatively transform the well-worn and outdated, but to ingeniously create the stuff of future nightmares. Iconography, or icons, is a vital component to any genre because it refers to those elements of a genre we immediately acknowledge. For the purpose of brevity, we've chosen to focus on 3 icons that we feel best act on behalf of the horror genre and help in identifying its real nature. Many horror films trade in remote and faraway settings to drop the viewer in an unknown place and to establish the utter helplessness the characters must endure. Whether it be a colorless wasteland like in The Thing or The Terror, the vastness of outer space like in Event Horizon or 2001: A Space Odyssey, or the little-known forests in The Village or Antichrist, the isolated setting can be just as ominous and fear-inducing as the threat that may or may not inhabit it. Of course, not all horror films celebrate a far-off and unexplored setting that appeals to our fear of the unknown. Many horror films appeal to our fear of what is known by setting the story in an urban or suburban location. Films like The Sixth Sense, Ju-on, and Candyman, to name a few, scare us not because they take place far from what is familiar, but because they make us question the safety and security of our everyday surroundings. With horror, we can take away the fact that the setting is neither meaningless nor chosen at random, but actively contributes to advancing the plot, limiting the characters' choices, and producing the desired effect of terror. We can be made to feel dizzy, claustrophobic, dumb, sick to our stomachs, helpless, or without recourse, and all because the setting has crept into our minds as if it were a monster in and of itself. All in all, it may not really matter whether the setting is a distant place or not, but the fact that there is real danger there, and that danger is accompanied by a symphony of nightmarish sounds. The score of any horror film is crucial in mirroring the events of the plot and instilling the viewer with feelings of unspeakable terror. For the horror genre, sounds are used predominantly as a weapon. They assault the senses of the audience by adding suspense, heralding moments of fright, and reflecting the dread and anxiety of the characters. Arguably the most distinct and memorable feature of horror films, the score is different from other genres in a variety of ways that beg attention. Suspense-building chords, like the alternating tuba notes in Jaws, and the high string stabs in Psycho, compel us to intuit that an imminent threat is approaching, and there's nothing we can do to prevent the incoming attack. Simple, but psychologically rousing piano melodies, like the tubular bells in The Exorcist, and the rattling theme in Halloween, create a chilling uneasiness that traps and keeps us in a state of disquiet and uncertainty. Atonal progressions, like the clatterbone rhythms of The Shining, and the loud, screeching violins of Insidious command our attention with their unhinged approaches and unearthly atmosphere. More than simply jolting viewers with timely jump scares and movie title introductions, the scores of horror films play a pivotal role in backdropping the story and telegraphing, whether gradually or at an instant, emotional responses to an audience. The strangling strings and satanic choruses, the tension-filled melodies and haunting synthesizers are not merely dark mood setters that prompt the turning down of the volume, but linger in the mind long after the final credits have rolled and compel us to look inward, to examine our own private horrors with a soundtrack that seems to illuminate and force them into focus. Although setting and sound are important icons that serve important functions in all horror films, there are special tropes and images that belong to the many subgenres of horror. These not only distinguish the horror genre overall, but also help differentiate one subgenre from another. In paranormal or supernatural horror films, one interesting icon is the use of some form of technology. In Ringu, Sadako kills because of a videotape and enters the physical world through a television screen. In Shutter, only the photographs that Toon takes with his camera reveal the true nature of what's haunting him. The entire film of Unfriended is framed in a video chat, and digital lags and glitches are used to ratchet up the horror caused by the supernatural entity. The use of technology in these films serves as an acute commentary on, and perhaps a much-needed warning of, the power of technology in governing our everyday lives. Of course, many of us are also familiar with icons that belong to the occult or gothic horror genre. There are the old-fashioned mansions or haunted houses, like in The Haunting and The Woman in Black. Emphasizing traditional lore and sacrificial rituals are films like Sinister, The Conjuring, and His House. These icons remind us of the gothic influence of the genre, but also the religious and cultural backdrops that still resonate and have influence on our modern society. Blood, overall, is an icon that overlaps many of the subgenres of horror, but is perhaps most well associated with the films that belong to the slasher and torture subgenres. Whether it's the typhoon of Johnny Depp blood in A Nightmare on Elm Street, Anna being flayed alive and left to hang in Martyrs, or even the simple but effective tooth-pulling scene in Old Boy, the visual sight of blood and its associations with injury and death have long been staples of the horror genre. Even playthings, such as toys and dolls, have become a horror icon in themselves and juxtapose the innocence of children with more adult-related experiences. The titular doll in the Annabelle series, the ventriloquist dummy in Dead Silence, and even the snow globe in Krampus resonate with both children and adults and serve to underline the all-important need to protect children from harm. These and many other horror tropes deepen the thematic content of the genre and enrich our ability to separate horror from non-horror. But the iconography of horror films, while making it easy to spy a horror film at a glance and from a distance, is not as much a determining factor in a horror film as the plots and themes of the genre.